long. I don't actually have any slides to show you, but I've got one or two things to say. I'm actually delighted to be here, and I'm even more delighted to see a room full of people actively engaged in this programme, really exciting programme to try and turn Sheffield into a really physically active city. Why should I, as Director of Public Health, be interested in physical activity? I think, to me, the answer is obvious. I guess to many of you, the answer may be obvious as well. But it's perhaps worth reiterating how important physical activity is for our health. We know that being physically active protects against a whole range of diseases, from diabetes to various forms of cancer. It certainly helps mental well-being. Possibly doesn't do very much good for your knees in the long term, but we'll perhaps gloss over that. But overall, physical activity is a really, really good buy. And one of the former chief medical officers said that if physical activity could be marketed as a pill, it would be an absolute panacea for many of the problems that face us in modern life. So it's a really, really important issue for the city. One of the things that struck me a few years ago when I looked into the data, we in public health railed for years, for decades, about the evils of smoking and how bad smoking is for people's health. And that's true. I mean, if you smoke, you're going to die 10 years earlier on average. Kills half the people who do it. It's a really, really bad idea to smoke, I'm sure most of you do. But when you look at the population as a whole, in fact, physical inactivity is as much of a problem as smoking. Because now we have smoking levels down to about 21, 22% of the adult population, but somewhere in the region of 70% of the adult population are not as physically active as would be good for their health. So if you look at the population attributable risk, to use the epidemiological jargon, physical inactivity is now as big an issue for the population's health as smoking. Now, within public health, we like numbers, we like to have some stats to crunch. And I was asked to dig out some figures about the levels of physical activity in the city. And one of the problems here is that measuring how physically active a population is not completely straightforward, because unlike smoking, for example, where people can, they fall into two groups, basically, either they're smokers or they're not smokers, or if they're smokers, there may be variations in how much they smoke. But you can ask someone, do you smoke or not? And it's a sensible and understandable question. But if you ask someone, are you physically active? It doesn't lead to a very easy answer. And so there are lots of different ways of measuring how physically active a population is. And an individual's level of physical activity has got a lot of dimensions. And there's how long you're physically active for, and there's how many sessions of physical activity you undertake in a week or however long it is. It's how intense the physical activity is. Is it just walking upstairs, or is it going and having a really good burn on a bicycle or whatever? So there are different ways of measuring it, and that sometimes causes difficulty when we look at statistics. But the Public Health Outcomes Framework, which is now the national set of indicators that are used to measure how healthy a population is, does contain an indicator on physical activity, which is the percentage of the population who are engaged or have been engaged in more than 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity in bursts of at least 10 minutes or more over the last 28 days. Over the last week. So it's quite a complicated definition, and on that definition, apparently, the figure for Sheffield is 54% of us have been active at that level. But I have to say that I wouldn't put a great deal of reliance on that, because I frankly don't think that 54% of us are quite that active. There's another measure that's commonly used, which is the Sport England survey, which asks people how many sessions of 30 minutes of sport they've undertaken over the last 28 days. The figures there for Sheffield are that apparently 39.6% of the population report that they have undertaken at least 4 sessions of at least 30 minutes of sport, not physical activity more broadly, in the last 28 days.
so a slightly lower figure of people claiming to be sporty. And that actually, there are quite big differences between men and women there, because whereas 48% of men report that level of sporting activity, only 31% of women do. So we see a difference there between the two sexes. If you want to look at more detailed information about how physically active people are, then the best place to go to is the Health Survey for England. And in 2008, they did a special focus on physical activity. And there's some interesting data that come out from that. In particular, data showing that the amount of physical activity we undertake at different ages is quite high for youngish adults. It stays pretty high until about the age of 65, and then it drops off quite steeply, both in men and women, after the age of 65. Not altogether surprising, but actually quite disappointing, because arguably it is the older age groups that may benefit most from being kept physically active, and those of you who keep up with medical journals will know that there have been recent reports, for example, about the benefits of gardening in older people. It staves off all sorts of illnesses and hospital admissions and so on and so forth. So we see inequalities across the age range. We certainly see inequalities between different genders. So again, the Health Survey for England data shows very clearly that men are more physically active in general than women. We'll just fish out the actual figures for you. So of the number of people who meet the recommended levels of 150 minutes of activity per week, for men it's about for men it's about 40%, and for women it's about 30%. There are also information in there about the way it splits across socioeconomic groups, and one of the things that interests public health, of course, is health inequalities, and we know from both from the Health Survey for England data and from Sport England's survey data that people in the higher socioeconomic groups, in the higher income groups, are more physically active than people in the lower socioeconomic groups. And there's all sorts of speculation as to why that might be. It's probably partly to do with the kind of environment in which people live, it's to do with the opportunities they have, it's to do with the amount of money they have, obviously, and the amount of leisure time they have. But it means that physical inactivity is one of the drivers of health inequality in the city. So, Ollie, I think, commented that over the last few decades, physical activity has, to a great extent, been engineered out of daily life. Certainly, if you look back 30, 40 years ago, the male working population was physically active. People had jobs that required the use of human brawn, and they were required to be physically active in the workplace. Women in those days, fewer of them were in the workplace, but the amount of physical activity that women undertook in domestic tasks was significantly greater than it is now. So what we've seen over the last few decades is a steady engineering out of physical activity from our daily lives. And I was interested to see reports again earlier this week which re-echoed some reports from over 10 years ago, which show that actually the overall calorie consumption of the population has not increased in recent years. A bit of a surprise to many people, because we know we're in the midst of an overweight and obesity epidemic, but actually, as a population, calorie consumption is not going up. So what's the explanation there? Well, the explanation is that we're not burning the calories we eat, and that's what's causing the increase in overweight and obesity in the population. So what can we do about it? Well, many of you here will know, as from personal experience and from our own, what's been going on, that public health, the leadership for public health in the city has now moved from the NHS to the City Council, and I think that gives us in public health some fantastic opportunities to work with colleagues who are already in the City Council working on the physical activity agenda, and indeed in other areas of public health, to try to engineer a step change in the level of physical activity in the city. What we need to do is to build physical activity into our daily lives. It's not just about getting people to be more sporty. It's great if people are more sporty. I have absolutely no problem with people becoming more sporty. But the real gains at population health level will not come from people taking up sport. It will come from people building physical activity, building walking, building cycling, building other forms of physical activity into their daily routines and into their daily lives. And I think that by working, for example, with the transport planners, by working with other colleagues across the council, we've got a real opportunity to do that. And I think Move More as a programme, as a brand, is a wonderful thing that we can get behind and do that. Now I'm going to end with a couple of quite personal sort of anecdotes, really. A couple of years ago, some of you know I'm quite a keen cyclist. I like cycling. Particularly like cycling to and from work. But some years ago, I took my slightly old backwards bike back to the guy who made it, the cycle maker the Wilsons up on the City Road. And some of you may have heard, I've been a bicycle maker in Sheffield for many years. To get it tarted up, put some new gear shifters on and some better this and better that, and then persuaded me to have it resprayed and so on and so forth. So, I did that, and when I went to pick it up and paid a fancy sum for it, we had a brief conversation about how much it should be insured for. And he said, well, you know, if you were to buy that new, it would cost quite a lot of money. And it was certainly quite a lot more than I had it insured for. So I said, okay, well, I'll bear that in mind. And as I was cycling home, it struck me that the cash value of my bicycle was about double the cash value of my car. And I thought, that's just as it should be. Because cycling is so much more important than driving. I thought I'd really got to the right place in life when the cash value of my bicycle was greater than the cash value of my car. And I think that should be an ambition for all of us, to have a really nice bicycle and a rubbishy car. Now, another little ambition, and this is really a challenge for all of us, I think, which is not my own idea. I'm very proud to pinch other people's good ideas if they come along. About a month or so ago, I was at a national meeting of the National School of Public Health Research, and the Chief Executive of Coventry City Council was there talking about public health having gone into local authorities, and he gave a very good presentation, and he was talking about the way in which public health can work with local authorities to re-engineer the local communities and give people, in particular, the opportunity to be more physically active. And he said, for example, we closed the ring road. What? I don't know if you know Coventry. Those of you who've been to Coventry will know it's basically a very sort of car-dominated city with a ring road that goes around the middle. It was built in the 1960s and really sort of hems in the city as a whole. He said, we closed the ring road and gave it over one day to people to walk and cycle and play games and have fairs on the ring road, and I thought, this sounds absolutely fantastic. Why can't we do that in Sheffield? So I emailed him that afternoon and got some contact details and spoke to one of the people who was very involved in it. And sure enough, he wasn't telling porkies. Last August, Sunday in August, they closed the ring road for 8 hours and gave it over to all of those things, to walking, cycling, having races around it, and so on and so forth. And I thought, what a wonderful ambition for Sheffield, to close the ring road for a day. I hope there's no one from the police around this, because they may be having a bit of a dicky fit at this stage. But why don't we have an ambition that by this time next year, we've had at least one day when we've closed the ring road and used it to have cycle races, to have running races, to have football games, to have pram pushes, to have fairs, food fairs, to have all sorts of things that don't involve just having cars driving around. And I'll just leave you with that thought and that challenge as something we should try to aim to do to show how Sheffield can move more over the next few years. Thank you very much.